psychology affects the law. Let's look at the other side, and this side is looking at how the law affects psychology. How many of you, and I might have asked you this before, so I'm sorry if it is a repeat. How many of you, anyone here thinking of practicing psychology in some way as a counselor, some capacity in psychology? Right? Quite a few of you. So there are laws protecting people who seek mental treatment, mental health treatment, right? And there are a lot of ethical concerns that therapists and people who practice psychology or even teach or do research have to follow. And it's kind of an interesting tap dance a little bit, if you will, right? There's kind of two sides of this as well, and we'll get to that in a second. But there are cases where somebody could be forced to undergo mental health treatment, potentially even against their will. Anyone know why someone, can anyone give me one reason why somebody might be forced into mental health treatment? Yeah. 5150. Yeah. 5150, if you've ever heard that term, it's the legal code, right, for someone who's been detained against their will for up to 72 hours. Anyone know why that somebody might qualify for 5250? Yes. 5150, sorry. Suicide, okay. So harm to themselves, suicidal, or there's one other part. Yeah, right. Harm to others or harm to self, okay? So if somebody is threatening to hurt someone else or hurt themselves, we can have them civilly committed, which means you can have someone detained for up to 72 hours, either in like a police facility or in a psychiatric hospital or wing or like part of a hospital. Kind of depends on the area and the resources and what's going on. But it is a very, very tricky thing, right? If someone is a minor, if someone's older, someone's an adult, right? There are different like laws and rules and things to protect people to make sure that patients have rights as well. And we have the right to treatment, but we also have the right to refuse treatment. Okay, so there's kind of like a fine line in between those. You cannot detain someone and not offer to help them. Right? For years and years and years, we put people into asylums and we did nothing to help them. You cannot do that anymore. You cannot lock someone away for an indefinite period of time and do nothing to help them get better. But you also have to offer treatment. So you have to offer treatment, but a person can refuse it, except for a few circumstances, of course. But patients have the right to treatment. If you have been involuntarily committed, if you're in a facility, you have the right to receive adequate treatment. Someone is going to help you, offer you medication, offer assessment to see what's going on. But let's say they assess you and they decide that you need medication. As a patient, as a client, you have the right to refuse to take that medication. To say, I don't want to take that. I don't want to receive this treatment. That's not something that I want for myself. And you have that right as a client, unless you're not of sound mind. Right? If you have schizophrenia, for example, and you're not able to understand the treatment options being presented to you, or you're not in contact enough with reality, a family member can override your decisions and sign a form, sign like a power of attorney or power of health, right, in order to override your choices and get you help. So you do have the right to say no, unless you're not of sound mind or aware of the circumstances around you, in which case somebody could override that. So this is a really difficult balancing act, right? You don't want to intentionally deprive people of opportunities for recovery, but you also don't want to unintentionally push something on them that they don't want to receive. So we have to walk that fine line. There was a movie a few years ago called Unsane, not insane, but Unsane, about a woman who's like tricked into being involuntarily committed into a psychiatric hospital. I don't know if any of you have seen it. Really interesting looking at some of these ideas. And the whole idea is you can't tell a good chunk of the movie if she's like hallucinating or in her right mind or not, right? So it's got kind of like that cool psychological like twist to it. But she signs some forms thinking she's just there for like a routine doctor's appointment. And then they involuntarily commit her and she can't get out, right? That couldn't happen in real life. You do have rights as a patient or as a client, unless they think you're not of sound mind, in which case it gets kind of blurry and messed up. So just something to be aware of, that patients do have rights. We try very hard to avoid the situations that we had years and years ago, where people were just locked up and forced to have dangerous or unethical procedures against their will. This is our last slide. Just gonna put that out there in the world, right? Last slide of the last chapter on the last day of lecture. I got it out of my system. Oh goodness. One other really big thing, there's a code of ethics that you're bound by as these are mainly related to therapy, but anyone who's practicing in the field of psychology. Again, that could be as a researcher, a therapist, a school psychologist, a social worker, a teacher, anyone who is practicing in a mental health profession is bound by a code of ethics, a body of principles and rules of ethical behaviors that are designed to guide your decisions and actions within a field, in this case, mental health. You have a lot of rules that you have to follow as somebody practicing in mental health. And these are for the rights of a client or a patient, and also to protect the therapist, right? They protect both in a way. And I have to tell you, this was probably one of the harder classes that I took in graduate school, right? The ethical guidelines for therapists, because it's so case by case, right? There are these rules that you have to follow, but oftentimes it involves a lot of like using your best judgment, consulting with other people and things like that to decide what is the best in that given situation. But a few of these code of ethics, there's a bunch of them. So let's just talk about some of the bigger ones here. Psychologists are permitted to offer advice. That seems really basic, right? Like, well, yeah, I went to you for advice. I hope you could give me some, but you are permitted to give your opinion and permitted to offer your advice to someone. And typically what we really encourage, which kind of piggybacks off of this bullet here, is you have to acknowledge your limitations. You can only give advice in areas that you have the expertise to give advice in. So if you don't know the answer to something or you don't have informed advice about something, you shouldn't be giving it. In which case, in those situations, you should refer your client to someone with more expertise or more knowledge in that area. Psychologists may not conduct fraudulent research or publish false data. If you, fabricate research, make up results, lie, or publish things that aren't true, you could lose your license. You could be fined. You could go to jail, depending on the severity. You're not allowed to publish fraudulent or false data in any way. You need to make sure that the results that you have and are reporting are accurate and true. Psychologists who make evaluations and testify in legal cases must base their assessments on sufficient information and substantiate their findings appropriately. Again, being within your area of knowledge and expertise, making sure that you have conducted sound assessments. And all of these have a lot to do with like integrity, right? Like making sure that you're doing the things that you should be doing, presenting information accurately and honestly. This is these last three are kind of like the biggest ones in terms of therapy kind of related things. But psychologists may not take advantage of clients or students sexually or otherwise. You cannot have what's called a dual relationship with a therapist. So, dual relationship. So you always see this in the media, in movies. It's always like portrayed in movies, but you cannot date or have sex with a therapist. You can't have any kind of intimate interaction with a therapist. It's a violation of a power dynamic, right? It is a dual relationship. So when you enter into therapy with a therapist, right, you should not be their friend. You should not be their, they shouldn't be your client in some other capacity. You can't have any kind of like inappropriate like relations with them in any way, whether that's emotionally or physically or sexually. You have to maintain those boundaries. And even as a teacher, like if I was still practicing as a therapist, I couldn't be your teacher and your therapist, because then we would have a dual relationship. I would have power over you in two different capacities, and that's considered unethical. So I couldn't be your teacher and your therapist. I couldn't be your teacher and your friend, right? Like we could be friends afterward, but I couldn't be your friend in the time that we were having this relationship together, right? And so it's very important to try and avoid this. And this can get tricky in small towns. So I went to school at Humboldt State, which is kind of a small community. And when I started my counseling program, I was also working at Starbucks, right? So when I first started it and my master's program, I worked at Starbucks for like 3 years, loved it. One of my favorite jobs, right? Caffeinated all the time for free. But I started hitting a point where I would have people come into Starbucks that were my clients, and I had to quit Starbucks because I couldn't have that kind of dual relationship. How awkward. You come into Starbucks to order a drink and your therapist hands it to you, right? Not okay, right? And I didn't feel okay about it either. Like I would see people come in, and it didn't happen often, but it happened once or twice. And then they would know where I worked. And I had one client who constantly came to Starbucks and would sit there and stare at me in the lobby for hours, which was awkward. So I had to quit working there because I couldn't have that dual relationship. If you're in a small town and your client is a dentist, you cannot go to your client as a client to be like as a dentist. You couldn't go to them. You would have to go to another town in order to see them. You have to make every possible effort to avoid a dual relationship. You have to wait 2 years. So mark your calendar, I guess, 2 years after finishing therapy with someone to enter into a romantic relationship with them. Any less than that can be considered a breach of ethical guidelines, and you could lose your license or get into quite a bit of trouble for it. So in general, you have to try and avoid this, right? And if a client is taken advantage of by a therapist, sexually or otherwise, that therapist could lose their license, go to jail, have all sorts of consequences for them. So really important to try and avoid that whenever possible. You also have to maintain confidentiality. Right? So if you go to see a therapist, anything that you tell them will stay confidential, meaning that they won't tell anyone else. Now, there are lots of exceptions to this, namely if you are a minor, or if you are a threat to yourself, a threat to others. There's a few others as well. If there's any suspicion of current child or elder abuse. Right, so if a client tells you about a situation where children are in danger, you have a duty to protect those children, to violate confidentiality and report that. If your client comes to you and says, I plan to murder 20 people tomorrow, you have a duty to protect those 20 people and report that, right? I plan to kill myself tonight. You need to protect your client and oftentimes have them committed. But here's where it gets crazy. Your client could come to you and say, I killed 30 people yesterday, and you can't say a thing, not a thing. And if you do, you could actually get in quite a bit of trouble for it. You have confidentiality because those people are no longer in danger. So you have to have current suspicion of harm or danger. So almost like a priest, right? Like if you went to confession, and you went to confession and you told a priest, I murdered 10 people. That priest cannot say anything. They're bound by confidentiality. A therapist, same thing, bound by confidentiality. But if you say, I'm going to kill those 30 people today or tomorrow, you have to report it, right? So that's where it starts to get a little bit blurry, right? And with all of these things, what happens is you have to oftentimes consult with other therapists. Therapists often go to therapy themselves. In fact, it's encouraged because other therapists are also bound by confidentiality. So what oftentimes you'll see is that one therapist will meet with another one and they talk about their clients and they kind of process things together, and neither of them can share anything about it, right? And so that's something that you see a lot because they can't go home and share that information with anyone else. This was one of the hardest parts of therapy to me. Like I would go home and I'd want so badly to tell my partner about like my clients in my day, and I couldn't, or I shouldn't, I should say. Like I would sometimes share like vague things, like I had a client today who was diagnosed with cancer and it was just so sad. Like, or I had a client today who was really suicidal, but I can't share any descriptive information at all. And I really should say as minimal as possible. And that's so hard to do. I'm such a like talk through everything that was always hard for me. Yeah.
So a therapist can go to another therapist and talk about their clients.
Yes.
Just they're both bound by confidentiality.
Yes. And in fact, oftentimes when you have people who are working within a network together, so let's say you have an office of therapists, they oftentimes will meet once or twice a week to do that. And so, I have a client, I'm not sure what I should do. Anyone have any thoughts? And they kind of bounce ideas off of each other. Or they go to full-blown therapy themselves to process the emotions and things that come up related to their clients. But yeah, because that other therapist can't share either because they're bound by confidentiality. So yeah, it's if any of you ever proceed to go through, the internship hours you have to do to become a therapist, you have to do something like 3,000 hours intern work before you can take the licensing exam. And in those 3,000 hours, if you go to therapy yourself, they count those hours as double. So 1 hour of therapy, if you go, they count it as 2 hours. And so it's really encouraged for therapists to go to therapy to process the things that are coming up, because you can't talk about them with anyone else except someone bound by confidentiality.
All under that confidentiality.
So it's very related to this. And oftentimes we're looking there specifically at patient rights, like medical patient rights, right? And where it gets the most complicated is with minors. When you have somebody who's under 18, that's when it gets by far the most legally like entangled. But it's the same principle of like, I won't share any of your medical information with anyone, or any of your psychiatric information with anyone. So it's the same idea, but it's a little bit more on the like medical side traditionally than maybe the therapy side.
I know there are some branches like the agreement that I signed with Oxford,
Yeah.
like you're allowed to give some stuff about it if it's for teaching purposes. or
Right.
Like some category after that, but most of the stuff you can talk about it.
Yeah. Right. And so like maybe you could share it under certain circumstances or very like general information, but you can't give any kind of specifics. Yeah. And again, in a small town, sometimes this is hard. Like I would run into clients out in the world, like, you know, like I'm not at Starbucks anymore because I quit, right? But out in the world, I would run into people and like my partner would know instantly because I'd get all weird, right? Like, because you're not supposed to say hi to a client in the world. Like you're not supposed to acknowledge them unless they acknowledge you, right? And so if the client comes up to you and says hello, then you can say hello back. But by saying hi to them first, you might be giving away the nature of a relationship and violating confidentiality in a way. And so like I would see a client and I would get all like, I would like try and avoid them almost because I didn't want them to feel pressured to say hello to me. My partner would know instantly, be like, was that a client? I'm like, I'm not going to answer that. You know? And of course, like that often meant it was. But you have to be really careful. You don't want to give away a relationship like that. You don't want to violate somebody's trust. If you don't feel like you can tell your therapist stuff in confidence, why would you tell them anything, right? If you knew that they were going to go out and tell it to everyone, you wouldn't feel safe. And so you wouldn't divulge any of that. And that's why that rule is there to protect your rights and your information. You had your hand up a little while ago. Did you have a thought? Oh, no, I thought you did. Are there any other like comments or thoughts or anything here? Okay. I had a thought and it left me. It was related to this. What was it? I'm trying to think of it. Yeah, again, this is something that's really tough in like smaller areas. In a bigger city, it's not usually such a problem, but you do have to be very careful to protect the rights of your clients. Yeah.
So if you're a therapist, you're supposed to be biased towards your client. If you want to invest for them,
Sure.
how does that kind of work in?
Yeah, I mean, and that can be tough. So, I mean, ideally, you're very neutral, right? But you obviously want to take their well-being into as much consideration as you can. But I'm assuming you mean biased in terms of like protecting them. Is that kind of more what you mean? Yeah, I mean, you're supposed to make every good faith effort to protect and help your client, right? And if you don't feel like you can do those things, then you actually should legally and ethically refer them to someone else. So there are times where clients come in and you can't work with them for whatever reason, like something about them rubs you the wrong way. Maybe they are there because they are a sex offender and you are so violently against people who are sex offenders that you can't work with them in a neutral way. You can't put their best interest in front, so you have to refer them to someone else. So, I mean, it's you're supposed to make that effort, and as much as possible, try to put their best interest first. The other, I was going to say, it came back to me, few other like random little things. You're not supposed to accept gifts from you're not supposed to give gifts to a therapist or accept gifts as a therapist, if that makes sense. And so I once had a client who brought me like this massive thing of like brownies, and I was in Humboldt, so I was a little worried about those brownies, to be honest. I was like, I don't know what's in them. I'll put them in the staff lounge and see what happens, right? See if the other therapists are wandering around confused, and then maybe I'll. But you're not supposed to accept gifts, right? Because it creates, again, like a power dynamic. But I always do this to my poor therapist because I told you, I go to therapy. I'll give her like a piece of candy or like a small thing every holiday. And she's like, you're not supposed to do this. And I'm like, I know, I'm sorry, I can't help it. I was like, you can just put it in the lounge. You can all split it 15 ways. I don't know. But you're not supposed to give gifts to people. And sometimes it's really awkward because clients oftentimes want to express their gratitude, but you can't accept gifts from them, or you really shouldn't accept gifts from them because it might create like an expectation or a power dynamic. You're not supposed to hug your clients. Oftentimes, you're not even supposed to touch them in any way. Now, this depends on the type of therapy. Some types of therapy, like sensory motor therapy, is very touch oriented. So if somebody is a touch oriented therapist, then it's a little different. They have extra training and so on. But you're not supposed to hug your clients or touch them in any way. And if possible, you're supposed to keep your distance. If they ask you for a hug, you can hug them, but it has to be like a tent hug where you're like as far away from them as possible. There's all these guidelines and again, the idea is that you're trying to protect the client, not create like a weird circumstance or power dynamic. But it's a difficult balance, right? Your client asks you for a hug and you say no, right? That could create problems too, right? And oftentimes clients have a lot of what's called transference toward their therapist. They might start treating them in a certain way that has nothing to do with that person. Right? It's very Freudian transference, but oftentimes what you'll see is that a client might be very, very kind and very praising of you all of a sudden out of nowhere, or very hateful and mad at you out of nowhere. And it oftentimes is related to someone else in their life. And that's why all these guidelines are there so that you don't misinterpret those kind of things as well. It's really important. Yeah, I don't mind at all. And we have the time, so go for it. Yeah.
You still have that duty to protect and report if it gets to a certain point or not.
Oh, and bulimia is tricky because it's obviously has health impacts, but it might not be like an immediate danger. So it depends on the severity. And that's where it's like case by case with everything. And so typically the rules are consult and refer, right? Those are like the two defaults. So what you would often do is consider how severe it is. Are they like an imminent danger, or is this like a slower like risk that we just need to consider? And you would probably have to consult with someone else to get an opinion. I two times as a therapist trainee. So I did like 1,700 hours, I think, before I switched gears. So 1,700 hours of therapy. And so in that time, I had 2 times that I had to, use this duty to protect. And I've 10 times here in my 10 years here, I've 11 or 12 times had to take somebody to the health center because I felt like they were a danger to themselves. So many more here than I actually would have thought. But in the 2 times, one of them was child abuse. I had a client who was being taken advantage of by somebody online. They were stealing money from me. And my client was like of a diminished capacity. She had intellectual developmental disorder and didn't understand what was happening. And so I had to call Child Protective Services and report her. And then I had one other client that was threatening to kill himself. He emailed me like in the evening and said, I'm going to kill myself. And I check my email all the time. And I received the email and I had to call the police, send them to his house, and have them detain him because I was afraid that he would harm himself. So those only twice. So the vast majority of the time, this isn't something that comes up, but it can. And when it does, you have a duty to keep that client safe or keep the people that they're threatening to harm safe. Yeah. Yeah.
If he wants you to call someone.
Yeah. I mean, if he had truly wanted to kill himself, right, he could have probably said nothing and just done it and it would have happened. Right. It was clearly a call for help. And like, thank God I checked my email, right? Because I might have saved his life. And we met afterward and it was a cry for help. And so thankfully I acted on it. But that's something for me, just as and it's kind of like a tangent to this. That was by far, other than the confidentiality piece, the hardest part of therapy for me. Like I'm a very like sensitive person and I take everything to heart. And so when I had clients who were suicidal, I would lay up all night and just be so worried that they would kill themselves and I wouldn't see them again. I didn't have the best therapeutic boundaries. I wasn't able to leave it all in the office. And that's a skill that you have to develop as a therapist. You have to care enough that your clients feel like you care and you're connected to them, but you can't care so much that it wrecks you as well. Right. And so I think that's something to know about yourself. I should have probably known that better about myself, but I thought that I could learn it along the way. But I would get stomach aches because I was just so worried about my clients. Like I cared too much in a way. And so, you know, I think that's something to be aware of. If you have a hard time with some of these ideas, you can learn to get better with them. And I went to therapy and talked about it with other therapists. But that was something that was always so hard for me. Because if my client had killed himself, I don't know if I could have recovered from that, like emotionally. I would have taken it like I failed, even though he could have made up his mind and there's nothing I could have done about it. So yeah, I do think it was a cry for help.
So like direct.
Yeah.
So to you.
Yeah.
Specifically.
So direct. Yeah. And you never know what you're going to get as a therapist. I mean, I had one client who called me 87 times one day. 87. I mean, I'm an obsessive person. 87's a lot. Right? Like when my partner and I were first dating, I think I called her once like 40 times. That's a lot. 87, excessive. Like, I mean, just over and over and over and over again. Like boundaries are difficult, right? But you have all these things, and sometimes having these is really helpful because you can default to them. You know, you'll be like, you know, it's not appropriate for you to be doing this. It's not appropriate for me to be doing this. And so you have these to kind of fall back on to help you as well. And this is, again, a whole class you would take. It's things you go over constantly with an advisor or supervisor. And it's very case by case. But these are things I might ask you about, especially the ones that we've talked a little more about here. And the idea of avoiding dual relationships with your clients or teachers or whatnot. Anything else? Any other questions or thoughts or anything here? Our last our last slide. So technically there was one after it, but I'm just kidding. So again, I want to remind you really quickly. I won't see you on Tuesday, right? I just realized that. I'm like, I just realized as I said that this is the last time I'll see you, and it made me really sad. I will be here all week next week. Okay, so I might see you. I'll be here Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And so if you want at any point to come by and like double check things with your grade, I'm here. If you have questions, I'm here. Email me first if you want to make sure that I'm free and can talk to you. But a couple of things with this, as I mentioned before, please check your grades on Canvas. Make sure everything is accurate and correct. If it's not, let me know now. This is the time to do that, rather than telling me like next week after grades are done. And start preparing for the exam. The study guide's up. It's the same format and style as you have been used to all semester online. So we won't meet in person, it'll be virtual. Sorry, let's just set a virtual class and just blurs together. But what will happen is Tuesday morning, the exam will open up at 12 a.m. and it'll close at 11:59 p.m. at night. So you can take it during our class time, which should be free, or you can take it at any time throughout the day. If you have questions, run into problems, you want to double check your grade, feel free to email me. And as so you know as well, I give a 1.5% or 10-point buffer when it comes to your grade. So if you're within 10 points or 1.5%, whichever's greater, of the higher score, I will give that to you. So if you're at like 88.8%, you'll end up with an A, right? Or a B if you were close to whatever. So just know that going into it, that I do give you a little bit of a buffer. Email me if you have any questions about your grade. Good luck studying. Thank you for this has been by far the most like unpredictable semester of all time. Thank you all for rolling with everything, whether it was online to in person or meeting in the hospital, right? It's been adventurous, we can say. But I feel like we had a really amazing class, and I'm sad it's over, and I'm stalling right now because I don't want to let you leave. Can you tell? I'm like, you can't leave. I'll just keep talking. You just have to stay here forever. But I wish you all luck. I'm here next week if you want to come say hello. Good luck on your finals. I will let you go. I'm gonna stop talking. You may leave. I give you permission, but thank you again, and I'll see you. I hope I see you soon. Okay.